All right, Luke, thank you very much, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We're really glad to have you here today. I find this a really interesting topic and an interesting trend in information security as well, too, this notion of engaging and working actively with security researchers to strengthen security for technologies pretty much across the board, not just applications or typical IT exposures, but the expanding concept of the role of the research community in strengthening security for everyone. Brief word about me. I've been an industry analyst for a while, which means I look at the products and services that characterize the market in information security. But before that, I was Chief Security Officer for a non-governmental organization, for the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization at its Vienna, Austria headquarters. And there we had something of a bleeding edge mission for things that weren't necessarily available as products or services in the private sector. So this notion of staying on top of what might not yet be known about security in the technologies that you're deploying is still very much of interest to me. So today we're going to talk about bug bounty programs and why working with the broader research community can be beneficial. It's an idea that probably still makes a lot of people wonder a little bit as far as working with the broader community, but there's definitely some things to be gained from working with the research community as a whole. We'll talk about 7 key aspects of a bug bounty program, and we'll talk about some specific guidance for your organization to consider as you weigh the advantages of what we're calling hacker-powered security. So with that, Luke, why don't we go to the first slide? So exactly what is a bug bounty, and more importantly, why should you care? Well, let's start with a little bit of a comparison to the non-digital world. Physical products are often subjected to real-world testing. In fact, in some cases, might actually be required. Aircraft and automotive industries, just to name 2. Pharmaceutical industries often have to subject their products to real-world testing to prove not only their efficacy, but also that they're safe for use and consumption by the general public. But software, it's inconsistent from one use case to the next as to what kind of stresses that software may actually face in the real world. And as a result, we have a lot of cases where software actually hasn't been subjected to the provider's knowledge of any sort of stress testing, if you will, that would show where its vulnerabilities really are, where its issues really lie. But there is a very active research community that is more than willing, either professionally or incidentally, to take a swing at technology that they find available for testing and exploit. So next slide. With that in mind, if you're deploying software or you're deploying technology, you have to keep in mind that if you're going to test it for its bug or security issues, you have to keep in mind that the testing is only going to be as good, first of all, as the testing that's applied to that technology or to that software, as well as the experts that are applying their knowledge. How broad, how expansive is that knowledge? If you only have a few eyes on your technology, on your software or products, and those eyes are moreover your own or just internal to your organization, or maybe a single outsourced contractor at a time that you have looking at your stuff, are they going to find, what do you think are the chances that they're going to find defects all across your exposures? And what about the expertise that they bring to the table? Do they have expertise across the full spectrum of knowledge and insight that they would need in order to identify issues that may be serious but may not be either obvious or visible to a limited number of professionals that you have working on your problem? Why not incorporate a pool of dozens or even hundreds of individuals with varied skills and backgrounds? Because this is something that's a lot more likely to produce more comprehensive results and give you the information you need, the insight you need to know in order to address the things that really are being seen as defects or security issues in the real world. Now, bugs just aren't about security, but security certainly is a top concern, and it is a regularly voiced concern among our surveys here at 451 Research. You also have to keep in mind that success in finding and fixing these issues is always a race against the clock. When someone finds them, if you don't at least participate in what happens after they're found, then you're going to find that the future of your ability to respond to these issues may be out of your hands. So why not formally engage that same community that finds these bugs, these defects, to help fix them? Next slide. So in the course of the evolution of the interaction of the security research community with software providers and vendors, we've seen this idea grow from a concept as far as, hey, why can't we work with the research community, to something that's actually been formalized to actively engage this community in discovering issues that should be prioritized for resolution. And it's not always been, I think it's going to be pretty obvious to everyone on this webcast, at least anyway, that this hasn't always been smooth sailing from the very beginning. In fact, a lot of times, and in some cases still to this day, organizations that are the subject of a researcher or a hacker looking at defects in someone's software or technology becomes a, let's say, contentious issue. We'll put it mildly. And there's a long track record of concern on the part of technology providers and vendors that, what are you going to do with this knowledge? Are you going to publicize it? Are you going to give us an opportunity to actually respond and fix this? So it's been a contentious and sometimes rocky road in working with the research community on the way towards efforts that can be of mutual advantage. And as this relationship has evolved over time, we've seen that a lot of organizations are willing to embrace a more formal program, because for them it really means the difference between discovering what can be found out about your defects, about your technology, or choosing to remain in the dark about what's already known and could be circulated widely about your stuff. In other words, just to paraphrase a quote that we hear every now and then in the industry, everyone gets a free penetration test. Whether or not you get a copy of the report really is very much up to you. So a bug bounty program, basically, in a nutshell, it describes a formalized set of processes to engage researchers and discover defects, define issues affecting performance of technology and software, security of that software, its behavior, in exchange for a reward in the form of either recognition, gifts, tangible gifts, or actual money. A program will clarify conditions for those incentives and define a consistent and reliable process for the submission, analysis, and validation of defect reports, and for issuing a bounty reward. Next slide. And over time, we have seen that those who have engaged in the bug bounty program have actually seen results. So a year ago, February, Facebook talked about the fact that they saw a 38% year-over-year increase in what they considered high-impact submissions, which talks about the efficacy of the research community in finding issues that really should be prioritized. In Google's program, a year ago, June, they reported up to a 50% increase in the amounts paid for high-quality vulnerability reports, which is a reflection of the extent to which the research community is actually finding issues that merit attention and remediation. So there's a positive impact to be realized from these efforts on things like, as we see the growing prevalence of the Internet of Things, for example, safety and life-critical issues, particularly with the growth in IoT, and not just smart systems, but systems that are pervasive in so many aspects of the physical world, medical technology, just to name one. There could hardly be any more of a direct impact on safety and quality of life than in some areas. The way that society depends on utilities and industry, transportation. Those are some other aspects where we would expect these sorts of programs to continue to catch fire and to have a positive impact on making our increasingly digital world more secure. Next slide. So that kind of begs the question, is a bug bounty program for you? Well, as you consider this, you have to consider the fact that, what's your chief concern, or what should it be when it comes to the discovery of a bug or a defect in your software? That you don't participate in what happens after that's discovered. It can go from being a bug that can be fixed, remediated, and solve a problem, to a bad outcome, regardless whether the issue is exploited or not, just from the way that the issue is handled, for example. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this isn't just about security, it's also about safety, the proper operation and reliability of technology, the confidence of your customers in the technology that you make available, and even in worlds such as online gambling, for example. Cheating can be an issue, and if you can figure out how to game a system, that could work to your disadvantage as a technology provider. So there's three key considerations you need to weigh in considering whether a bug bounty program should be for you. Do you or your technology have the visibility that would warrant, on the one hand, the attention of the hacker community to your technology, and on the other hand, the reflection on your public image, on your brand, that is connected directly to how you handle these issues once they're discovered? What's the criticality of your technology? What's the criticality to your business? If a high priority issue is discovered, the way you take action on it could have a definite outcome on the future of your business. We've certainly seen plenty of that just in the last several days. And along the same lines, notoriety being yet another issue. How you handle the report of a defect or a bug can again have an impact on how you and your brand is perceived in the public view, but also will have a hand in how hackers and researchers are perceived if they're effective at finding defects and your response does not seem to merit the same level of attention and diligence that a hacker or security researcher gives to your issue. That can also redound negatively on you and your brand. So these are some things that you want to consider in weighing whether or not a bug bounty program is something that your organization needs to consider. And it's important to note that these aren't programs just for technology companies. In fact, according to our friends on this webinar, HackerOne, 41% of the bounties launched last year that are launched through HackerOne were launched from non-technology industries. So this isn't necessarily just a technology issue. Do you have exposures that can be accessed publicly or by the hacker community in any sense? You might want to consider whether a bug bounty program is for you. Next slide. So, where do you begin to consider this assessments? Well, if your digital assets have any exposure to the inquisitive minds of the research community, you may find that someone has actually discovered a bug or a vulnerability. So the question then arises, how will you handle it? And that's the first thing that organizations should consider. If you have any exposure at all, how you handle it, it's going to happen. Someone is going to find something in your technology, in your software, and you do need to be prepared to respond. And yet, regardless of this, we still find that 94% of the Forbes Global 2000 don't have known vulnerability disclosure policies. So any organization with a public digital footprint, in fact, you already have a stake in hacker-powered security, as we're calling it. So why not do things right from the outset? Next slide. So let's talk about starting from the beginning, and we'll take a look at 7 steps that we've described towards hacker-powered security. We've written up in a paper that we produced in cooperation with HackerOne. We'll go over some of the high points of that research in these 7 issues. Next slide. So continuing from the previous slide we were talking about, the first and most important thing that any organization needs to do is to create a vulnerability disclosure policy and, just incidentally, make it easy to find. If someone finds issues, vulnerabilities, defects in your software, your technology, you're going to want to know, and you're going to want to be an active participant in what happens after. So it really behooves you to let the public know what your approach is to vulnerability disclosure before it becomes an issue. We consider this table stakes for any organization with any public footprint. And a vulnerability disclosure policy basically just ensures a clear process for communicating the issues involved, and also provides a way to enable those who do have the motivation to help discover and resolve issues for the better security of all. These issues, of course, again, don't need to be limited to bugs. They can also include things like configuration errors, or other exposures that are detectable in the public-facing exposure of your technology. But it doesn't mean that the process has to be complex. It can be something as simple as specifying an email address, but obviously the more detail you provide, the easier it is for those who are looking at your technology will find it to cooperate with you in getting these issues known to you and handled responsibly. Next slide. So what are the key elements of a vulnerability disclosure policy? Well, first and obviously most important, how to contact your organization, but also a clear description of the types of issues that are reportable. What what would you be looking for in reports of vulnerabilities or issues in your technology? If you can lay down some rules for finding and reporting bugs, as well as the scope of systems available on which to report bugs. For example, talking about scope, if on a given website you might have a blog that is associated with blog.yourdomain.com, and that could be out of scope even though it's on your domain because it points to WordPress, for example. Now, WordPress can be self-hosted, but it's just as often managed by a service provider, which is a third party that will almost certainly be out of scope for assessment of your technology. And that provider probably not going to have the deepest, warmest feelings about being assessed without warning, particularly if you don't specify the scope of technology that you're willing to consider in terms of vulnerability reporting. Talking a little bit on the previous slide about things like configuration errors, you might want to consider that things like this should be reported, yes, but they may not be resolved in the same way or through the same workflow as changes to application code, for example, which may have to go back to a development or maintenance team for resolution, where configuration issues would go to an operations team. So you may want to make some distinctions in the types of issues that can and should be reported under your policy. In other words, the bottom line is if you make the scope of a program too broad, the result could be way too much noise. But if you make it too narrow, you may find yourself missing critical vulnerabilities. And also, too narrow of a scope tends to reduce incentive for hackers, since a large number of testers with too little attack surface can sometimes wind up stepping on each other's toes, and that can result in increased duplicate or near duplicate submissions. So a few things to consider in defining vulnerability disclosure as you start from the outset. Next slide. There is guidance for putting a program together for you, beginning with the vulnerability disclosure process. In fact, there is an ISO IEC standard, which are basically guidelines for the vulnerability disclosure process, and this document is available for free at the ISO.org website. We've got the link to it here on the slide. Take note of that and pull that down if you're interested in learning in more detail about some guidelines that are suggested for defining a vulnerability disclosure process. Now, related to this is ISO IEC 30111, which describes guidelines for vulnerability handling in a separate document, just to make sure that you're aware of those distinctions. We'll talk about vulnerability handling in a little bit more detail shortly. Next slide. Also very useful, other documentation you may find helpful is the National Telecommunications and Information Administration in the United States, their template for vulnerability disclosure process. And there are 6 key points that they describe in this document, which is also freely available. You'll see the URL in the bottom right corner of the slides here, if you'd like to pull that down. And these 6 key points that are described in the NTIA template boil down to, first of all, the brand promise. In other words, putting a stake in the ground as far as making a statement about the safety, security of your customers, your stakeholders being important to you, and therefore you think it's worthwhile to promote a vulnerability disclosure process. You want to lay out some description of program and scope, and again, to outline which systems and capabilities are within scope, as opposed to those which should be off limits, and that may evolve as capabilities change. So you also want to consider a version of the policy to make sure that you're keeping the policy up to date, and more importantly, that those who access it are aware of the version of the policy that they're dealing with as the most current. It's also helpful to define the situations under which you will not take actions such as legal action, and this has become pretty important in light of the history of cooperation with the security researcher and hacker community. Legal action has often come up in the past in this connection, and so those who you're seeking to work proactively with and who want to work proactively with you are going not only to want, but going to need some assurance of the guidelines under which they can operate with you safely without fear of any kind of retaliation or legal impact. Mechanisms and processes for communication, vitally important, and again, we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail as well too. preferences for submissions and prioritizations, which don't necessarily have to be binding on your organization, but again, just to give some guidelines to the researcher community. Next slide. So I mentioned on the last slide that communications is one of the paramount issues with a bug bounty program and a vulnerability disclosure program in general. It's probably one of the most critical aspects of a program, because just how you respond when these issues arise, how you interact with the community, with your constituents and stakeholders, customers, and with the general public could make a very big difference on the impact on your brand and on your business. And if there's a key idea that really goes a long way towards seeing you through these situations when they arise, it's the idea of being transparent and responsive. And that means that the people that you put in charge of communications for these purposes understand how to recognize and handle a disclosure. There are several examples of things not to do. One example was when an Israeli researcher found as many as 40 zero-day vulnerabilities in the Samsung Tizen operating system. And despite the fact that Tizen is currently running on millions of devices, and the researcher didn't find one but 40 0 days, this individual only received automated email responses to his reports over several months, and it wasn't until after he was contacted by a journalist did the technology provider, in this case, spring into action and get in touch with the researcher. Probably not the best way to handle that kind of a scenario when it arises. There are some cases of what to do right and what to do well. And if you remember back in 2013, I believe, social media orchestration service Buffer had a breach, and that was arguably some of the best marketing that Buffer had ever received. It was very transparent, went to social media immediately, responded to individual inquiries as they came up in the view of the public, very customer-centric handling, and turned an unfortunate event into as good a situation as it could have been under the circumstances. I mean, it was a breach after all, and turned it into a marketing win, attracting new customers, drawing considerable positive feedback and support from the public and the general community. So that's not a case where better vulnerability disclosure could have helped, but it is rather an example of how honest and transparent communication can make the best of these kinds of situations. And when you find yourself in a situation when your internal processes don't prevent something like a breach. So planning for failure is a good way to make the most of a bad situation in that sort of case. More recent examples include Cloudflare's Cloudbleed bug, which was discovered by Tavis Ormany at Google Project Zero. GitLab's database incident, that's another example. In the Cloudflare case, Cloudflare responded less than an hour after learning about the bug. And in GitLab's case, it was human error, but again, the company received a lot of positive coverage for its transparent handling of the issue, which even included a live YouTube feed, soliciting advice from commentators on Twitter and Reddit. I mean, that's an extreme case, but even just a fraction of this transparency and responsiveness can go a long way in winning over customers and the general public. Next slide. You'll want to, of course, document and then practice vulnerability handling so you can get your process from a point where it's defined on paper into something that you've actually been through, first in a trial format and then exposed to actual researchers, perhaps not publicly at first. You might not want to bite that off right away, but try your processes with some that are actively involved in this sort of research and refine the process as it matures, taking input from industry standards where they're relevant. And then again, we've identified the two we mentioned earlier here on this slide, to the point where your process does become predictable and consistent. You have to keep in mind that, again, having a clear and common set of rules and expectations that is easy to locate is critical. A lot of times hackers will have poor past experiences that could shorten their patience, quite frankly, when reporting a vulnerability, and that may leave you with only days or hours before an impatient researcher goes public. So a quick response to disclosure really could mean the difference between a PR nightmare and a mutually beneficial relationship. Next slide. So taking a look at some of these processes in detail, I think some of these may be fairly intuitive to you, but they're also fairly common. The discoverer finds an issue initially, locates the vulnerability disclosure policy, so again, just how important that is to make that easy to find, relays the report to the organization which receives it, provides confirmation when relevant, and the researcher is notified of the time frame window within which to respond. Or a subject organization performs the analysis, notifies the discoverer of the results, may notify notify them of a schedule or timeline for fixing the issue. This is done in cooperation with the organization's engineering and development teams, obviously in terms of receiving and validating the reports. Those that are invalid are relayed back to the researcher. Those that are valid and require remediation, engineering will determine a level of effort and resolution estimate, queue the issue for resolution to the extent that they can internally, and when appropriate, will publish bug and patch advisories as required. The researcher will also be notified of resolution. That's the process in general, and the key themes there are common set of rules and expectations, easy to locate process and policy. And again, coming back, just touching on communications a bit, with communications, you might want to consider separating those of your communications team that receive general inquiries from the public from those who will receive this specific type of communication to make sure that vulnerability reporting doesn't get lost in the noise of other communications channels. Also making sure that your teams are properly trained on handling these types of reports, because a lot of times, a researcher may get frustrated if they feel like the issue isn't being handled responsibly or is not being handled competently. In a lot of cases, the company's social media accounts are the easiest route to getting a hold of the company, so people monitoring those accounts should really be prepared for recognizing and handling disclosures of bugs and these other issues. Next slide. So let's say you've defined these processes, you've refined them internally through testing them in actual practice, you've tested them privately with a group of trusted researchers, you're ready to consider perhaps moving along to a formal bug bounty program. Next slide. If you're going to do that, you're probably going to want to consider a bug bounty platform provider for a lot of reasons. Consider, first of all, that you're escalating the number of inbound communications you're going to get by an order of magnitude. And say that anecdotally, but the issue remains. You may find yourself overwhelmed with the inbound notifications that you receive from well-intentioned individuals who are trying to find something and, frankly, expect a reward for doing so. That's going to open the door to a lot of issues that you're going to want to consider. Is this really your primary business? Is this something instead you'd rather consider outsourcing to someone who's not only prepared to deal with it, but makes that their primary business? So when you consider a bug bounty platform provider, they can help with the design of programs. They can provide a software platform to manage submissions and help manage the process itself. They have expert guidance to help with implementation of processes vital to the success of your program, everything from triage and handling of initial reports to working with the community, and stable access to a talent pool that they're already in contact with through the other programs that they already support. Management issues of the platform, integration with workflow. These are just some of the features that a bug bounty platform provider can provide that can help you with something that's not your primary business, but does require a fair amount of consistency, attention to detail, and maturity in handling in order to be successful. Next slide. And one of the key things a platform provider can offer to you is the ability to automate and orchestrate the process for you. And just to take an example, in the first 100 days that Yelp ran a public bug bounty program, they received over 500 reports inbound, of which 57% were duplicates. And a full 525 of the 564 reports they received weren't actionable, and that's 93% of the reports that came in that people would have had to sort through, and moreover, Yelp's people would have had to sort through without the support of automation for triage and integration with workflow to handle these issues. So there's a lot of advantages in working with a platform that's designed to automate and orchestrate these processes. Next slide. And then what about measuring success? When you take a look at your bug bounty program, Obviously, you're going to want to be able to say if it's been successful or not. There's a number of metrics you can look at, like the number of high severity bugs that have been reported, the number fixed, but how about reducing the number found in a bounty in the first place? And this is something of a trend in some bug bounty programs. You'll find that the sheer number of issues being dealt with and resolved goes down, and part of the reason for that is that as software security and quality processes improve, it may become that much more difficult to find actionable defects in that software over time. So, interesting metric to consider there in terms of things that go down as a measure of success. Some other examples might be helpful in terms of the number of issues per 1,000 lines of code. That's been adopted as a fairly common software quality metric across other aspects of software quality management. Number of critical flaws handled per development cycle. Time to resolution obviously being a pretty informative one in terms of your own internal processes. And again, this is something where a formal bug bounty program can really be helpful because you have very definite information, first of all, when you were first notified of the issue, when the issue went to your team, and then you can measure the time coming out of that when there's been successful resolution. And if the issue is confirmed as resolved by the fact that it's not been raised again or subsequently by other researchers, you can have pretty high confidence that the issue has in fact been resolved. Next slide. So if you're considering a bug bounty program, again, start small, start with something that you can bite off and handle initially. And when you get comfortable with, in this case, what we would recommend is a private bug bounty program, then you're prepared to go public. Taking these as stages being the best way to grow not only in confidence and competence internally, but in the confidence that the researcher community will have with your efforts. You also tend to get to actionable results potentially a lot more quickly. Going back to Yelp's public bounty as an example, that program still managed to find 39 more actionable vulnerabilities in only 100 days when they went to a public program, considering that the private, and this might have something to do with the fact that the private bounties researchers had had 2 years to comb through Yelp software immediately prior. Now, the fact that all that software had been combed through by private researchers and still opening up to the public program, finding 39 new issues within the first 100 days, that gets back to what we raised at the beginning of the webcast, that the more eyes with the more skills that you put on your technology, the more likely you are, in principle at least, to find issues that are actionable, should be high priority, and resolve them. So there's definite advantages of going from private to public, but you need to be ready for it. The positive public image that you get from a public program being another beneficial aspect. In the case of AT&T, for example, where the scope includes nearly all aspects of the business, that's a pretty impressive and a bold undertaking. It makes a very strong statement about the company's commitment and confidence and determination to improve the quality and security of its technology, which in turn will likely attract customers and partners as well. Next slide. Finally, you'll want to continue to refine and expand your program. We talk a lot about this ancient developer proverb that we invented ourselves here at 451. Before your bug bounty, chop wood and carry water. After your bug bounty, chop wood, carry water. A bug bounty program is not a one and done program. It's a process, and with any process, it can be improved. And it's also most valuable when it's used as a permanent and perpetual addition to the software development life cycle in your organization. An ongoing bug bounty program can return a lot more value as hackers get to know your team, your products, your code, your processes and preferences, and other nuances. So keeping it fresh and keeping it current and continuously improved definitely will be to your advantage. Next slide. So if you're ready to explore, you have to consider that the goal isn't necessarily 0 bugs, but quick, consistent fixes and fewer critical bugs. So assess the level of effort, the coordination of activities and processes on multiple fronts you'll have to orchestrate, and the need to responsibly handle the tangible assets involved in bounty reward determination and payment in order to take this on. These programs don't have to grow necessarily for these processes to become cumbersome very quickly. You got to remember that these are not central to the business of your organization prior to launching a bounty program, but they are vital to the program's success. So for all these reasons, as you consider your program, consider the maturity involved, consider platform providers that can help ease these responsibilities or outsource them entirely, and consider for yourself where you should go beyond the basic table stakes in order to have an appropriate and responsible bug bounty program for your organization. Luke, let me send the webcast back to you.
Great, thanks, Scott. Awesome stuff. All that's listening, make sure you can ask your questions now through the question box on the right-hand side of your panel. I'm going to kick it off, and we also have McKeel on the line, so we'll be kind of serving you guys up with some questions to for our audience. We got about 24 minutes, so we should have some good time for Q&A here. So Equifax, it's in the news constantly the last week and a half. It's national, international news even. You know, we talk about the table stakes with the vulnerability disclosure policy. You mentioned the 94% number, the whopping 94% of the Forbes Global 2000 don't have that VDP. So maybe the question is, like, spending some time, you talked about the virtues of VDPs, but how would maybe Equifax's experience in this been different if they would have had, at a minimum, a vulnerability disclosure policy? Scott, we'll hand it off to you first.
Yeah, that's a really good example, Luke. And I mean, by their own admission, corroborated by the Apache project, the well-known struts vulnerability was at issue in Equifax's case. And you can kind of trace the trajectory of this issue just knowing that one data point. Mm-hmm. So once that vulnerability was made public, obviously struts pretty widely deployed, widely adopted in a lot of applications, and a knowledgeable hacker is going to look for incidents of that. And for those that have, you know, a formal disclosure policy and program, a lot of those doubtless would have been notified when those exposures are public. An organization might have a pretty good idea where they've implemented struts, say, but it may be more implemented or present more widely than they might have realized. So that's one advantage to having a formal disclosure program right there. In Equifax's case, it's very light. Well, obviously, someone did discover the vulnerability, but someone well-intentioned could have discovered the vulnerability, let them know, and moreover, the internal security organization at Equifax could have used that knowledge in order to prioritize and escalate the resources to remediate that issue. I mean, we're talking about an integral aspect of probably business-critical applications. Not probably, definitely in this case.
Right.
Those take some time to resolve, to take these apps offline in order to do the resolution, to deploy the update, the QA testing that's involved. That takes a while to iterate through. But, you know, knowing about this from the responsible and cooperative hacker community could have escalated the effort invested in this and possibly helped avoid a lot of the heartache that we've seen since then. So yeah, it's very surprising that an organization that's responsible for handling such sensitive information didn't have a VDP in place.
Yeah, you know, a mega data broker, so to speak. And McKeel, I mean, I don't know how many thousands of different endpoints that Equifax had, but it's a lot. And, you know, whatever size, they're a big company, a multi-billion-dollar company. But, you know, having hundreds, even thousands of eyes can make a huge impact. And to kind of lob that same question over to you, what are, from your perspective, you know, what are some ways that the VDP would have made a huge difference for Equifax?
Yeah, good question. I think Scott's answer was actually excellent here. Next to the Apache struts vulnerability that we read about, I think also recently there was some news about a couple of administration portals on Equifax's infrastructure not being protected by very strong passwords. I believe there were some instances of very easy to guess passwords. And
like admin?
Like an admin, exactly. And these are the types of things that would be very easy to catch with a VDP or even a bug bounty program. If somebody stumbles upon that panel and just tries an easy to guess password like admin and is able to log in, then how are you going to tell that company, in this case Equifax didn't have a VDP, but how are you going to tell that company about that vulnerability? Me as a hacker, the first thing I will do is I will try to go to their website, try to see if they have some kind of security contact on their website. Do they have a VDP? Where can I find the VDP? So all these questions go through your head as a security researcher when you find a vulnerability. And I can totally imagine that if you aren't able to identify a VDP easily, a lot of researchers may not even attempt to contact the company at all because you don't know what's going to happen. That promise of, hey, if you stick within the rules of our VDP, we're not going to pursue any legal action. If that promise is not there, I can totally imagine lots of researchers just doing the opposite and not telling the company about it at all.
Right. Getting the Samsung auto reply special, right?
You know, there's a really good acid test for accessibility of a VDP. It's really, really difficult to implement. Is everybody ready? Got a pencil out? Take notes. Put into a Google search box, vulnerability, disclosure, and your brand. What comes up? It should be as easy as that to discover your policy. And if it's not that easy, you definitely have a ways to go in making sure that the wider community has some idea how you intend to respond when these issues arise. Yeah,
that's a great point. Michiel, let's kind of, Scott had a great slide, I think it was slide 23, and it was that graph of the kind of that circular virtuous feedback loops, and would love to kind of get some either anecdotal or stories from you about how you've seen companies maximize some of these feedback loops and benefits of bug bounties.
Yeah, good question. So a lot of software organizations nowadays develop in a more of a continuous method and kind of doing away with a lot of the older waterfall development methodologies and taking on a more of an agile development approach. And that kind of asks for continuous security as well. So when you're deploying new code all the time, you're maybe used to doing penetration tests every quarter or maybe 2 times per year or whatever time frame you generally do this. And if you deploy software multiple times a day, you're going to have quickly an outdated pen test, right? You do a pen test once a quarter, so there's almost a quarter of unknown code and untested code in your production systems. So bug bounty programs really can provide that continuous security and immediately provide feedback about when you deploy new code. There's always someone, one of those thousands of researchers out there, there's always someone on the lookout and potentially able to find a vulnerability and send it into you so you're able to start the vulnerability handling process and get it fixed. Some of the more creative ways I've seen people use bug bounties is actually they are using basically they're tracking a lot of metrics about their program, such as the metrics that Scott already talked about, but some of the others are more focused on where in your attack surface or where in your assets are you seeing most vulnerabilities and what kind of vulnerabilities are you seeing there. And based on that kind of like trend analysis of your bug bounty data, they can make a lot of future and more strategic decisions about where they take the security of their application. So an example I heard from one of our customers is where they are using the bug bounty program, and they were able to quickly find out that they had a cross-site scripting vulnerability problem. And a lot of the cross-site scripting issues were across one application. And it turned out that was a application the company had acquired a few years ago, and it wasn't using the standard best practices that most web development frameworks are implementing nowadays. And they were able to quickly find out that there was a more broader problem with that application, and they had to take on a project to basically fix cross-site scripting in that specific asset once and for all, and making sure it doesn't return by adopting a best practices framework.
Right. Scott, any thoughts to add to that?
Yeah, it's just, Michiel, you just provided a really good example of the value of a bug bounty program in continuous development, continuous integration. And yeah, you're absolutely right about the continuous nature of the way that DevOps is changing development and rolling software and applications into production is a lot of incremental changes, upgrades, feature tweaks, feature adds and mods that happen all the time, or pretty close to all the time, at least anyway. And if you're relying strictly on internal processes to evaluate and test for those every time a change comes up, first of all, that's a good thing. You should be doing those assessments, but you need to be able to integrate them with your approaches to automating your pipeline and your tools. But when it comes to actually deploying these in production, again, it's not one and done. They're in production. They are visible to the wider community. And this is a good way to get continuous feedback that feeds into continuous development and integration. And there's ways to tie that feedback in. If you have a mature enough and well enough defined vulnerability handling process, you can integrate triage directly into your ticketing systems, which then takes it directly back to your developers. Prioritization of the issues can also be factored into your bug bounty program, so that you have a lot of automation that is on the same level, if you're a pretty mature organization in adopting these tools, with the level of automation that you're applying to your DevOps processes. So this is a really good way to not only get security and defect testing more continuous, but also more realistic, better prioritized against real-world conditions, which means better prioritized with your development and maintenance teams, which means better utilization of your resources.
Right, so some of those cascading benefits, and I know we even, you kind of dove into that a little bit in the research report, Pathfinder report, that we kind of based our material on today. Just a quick reminder for everybody, Elizabeth, Garrett, Jeremy, anybody online that has questions, make sure you shoot those our way. I'm going to keep running, guys. I got a list of great conversation points that we can do, so we'll go on to the next one. And this one, guys, Scott, we'll start with you here. It's kind of maybe some conversations you've had, whether you know, cocktail conversations or conversations in the boardroom or what have you, that you kind of see typical blockers for adopting bug bounties. And what do you kind of tell maybe the CISO or companies that have their doubts? And what are some of those top doubts that you hear? And what do you say to that?
I think probably if I had to pick one that comes up most often, it ties back to the notion of security through obscurity. Because we don't know who's picking the locks on our doors, we're therefore pretty confident that no one's broken in. That's obviously way grossly oversimplified, but the idea there being, do we really want to open up our stuff to the, to exposure to researchers? Do we? The next level up from that, of course, is we know that people are looking at our software. We know that they're trying out our technology. We know that there's probably issues in it. Do we actually want to throw the door open and say, yeah, let us know, have at it, throw them to us? So on the one hand, it's the notion of the notoriety of making yourself open to that sort of interaction. And secondly, it's the potential volume of what you're likely to get coming inbound. So this is one reason why we get back to talking about the maturity of a program. First of all, define your processes, test them internally, then test them with a trusted few researchers, and maybe initiate a private program or expand that private program gradually until you reach a point of comfort with that before you even consider anything like a public program. So first of all, important to consider, you're not throwing the doors wide open. You're not throwing the doors open to someone who's going to take your company apart. If that's an issue, they're already looking at you anyway. So it's not really an issue with this sort of a process. You don't have to throw yourself into the deep end from the outset. It can start small. It can be manageable. I think that's probably one of the first things I would say to anyone who has doubts about a program.
Yeah, and Mikhail, I know we could probably spend the rest of the time talking about your experiences and conversations you've had, but would love to get some of your kind of quick insights from what you hear on the front lines.
Yeah, I think a funny one we see quite often here at HackerOne is when we're talking to a CISO, it's typically a CISO that has just started in their new role, because a lot of organizations are realizing they have to set up a mature security organization, and maybe before it would fall under a different type of organization, or maybe be absorbed into an engineering type of organization. But now they're kind of setting up these security orgs, and they have to build out these security programs. So we're talking to a lot of fresh CISOs that have just landed their job there a couple weeks ago, and they're just exploring what kind of things they can do. And bug bounty is one of those things they're exploring, or even vulnerability disclosure programs. And sometimes what we hear there is that they are afraid that they do not have the resources to fix the vulnerabilities coming in. So a common fear is that there's going to be lots of vulnerabilities coming in, whereas some of them may be invalid and some of them may be valid, and you need to have the resources to kind of sift through those reports and analyze if they're valid or not. Those problems are kind of solved already. There's lots of stop augmentation services out there. We even offer that ourselves too, where we can have analysts help our customers validate and sift through those reports. But then the work of actually fixing those vulnerabilities is still in the hands of these companies. You still have to be able to fix those vulnerabilities yourself. And oftentimes we hear that the lack of developer resources or the lack of priority in the engineering organizations is impacting how many vulnerabilities they can fix. And usually what we answer there is it's still better to know your risk profile and to know about those vulnerabilities, even if you're not able to remediate them right away. And then some of the things that are really important are that professionalism of communication and keeping the researcher engaged and keeping them up to date about why you're unable to remediate this right away and what is kind of stopping you from doing that right away. And that responsiveness and transparency, like Scott presented in his deck.
Right. Mickey, we'll kind of let you keep rolling here. So I kind of want you to get out your crystal ball and talk about, what are some of the predictions there or things that you see going on in evolutions of the AppSec kind of industry in the next year? What would you like to see that you're not seeing now?
What I would like to see for sure is that whenever someone, it could be a security researcher, it could be a customer of a certain product, finds a security vulnerability, and they would type in vulnerability disclosure and company name in Google, like Scott mentioned, that the first result shows up and there is actually a vulnerability disclosure process in place. There's still a long way to go there, and that's why I'm mentioning this in the crystal ball, because there's still a long way to go there because, like Scott mentioned, it's only like 94% of the Forbes Global 2000 does not have a vulnerability disclosure process. And they do have a lot to lose. There's lots of large businesses in there that have a lot of very sensitive information to protect. And I would love to see all of these businesses start to set up these VDPs, and at a minimum a VDP. Obviously, a bug bounty would be way better for all of the researchers out there, and they would obviously love to jump on those opportunities and invest all of their time in researching those applications. But at a minimum, I would love to see all these organizations set up vulnerability disclosure programs that are easy to discover, so vulnerabilities can be caught and reported to organizations.
Awesome. Scott, I know you see a kind of a kaleidoscope of different companies that you work with and research projects. So what's kind of top of mind for you these days, and what are you looking forward to seeing in the next year in our industry?
Yeah, well, Mikhail kind of alluded to that in talking about DevOps and how the changing nature of development is getting much more towards continuous feature augmentation. Many more smaller deltas, feature additions to applications happening much more quickly. And most of the tools and technologies that have been deployed up to this point, Mikhail is right, they've really been kind of predicated on large point-in-time assessments, tend to be monolithic assessments, breaking those down into more incremental delta-type assessments, periodically looking at an entire application, but more often looking at changes to the application made over time. So the increasing engagement of automation in concert with the increasing use of automation with development and operational deployment, the role of programmable infrastructure as code. When you push an app, you're actually pushing it with the definition of the underlying software infrastructure, which may include a container or microservice design, purpose designed to house that particular application. So where does the operational aspect of that come in? Seeing more attention being paid to that over time. But also, to Mikhail's point, the fact that these sorts of assessments can become more continuous and incremental. That's a great thing, but they also have to become more realistic, and the ability to open up input from those who actually have contact with a publicly deployed or widely deployed technology application becoming pretty important. I think we're going to see a lot more of this sort of engagement in some critical areas as IoT becomes even more widely penetrated. I mentioned a couple of the areas, healthcare being one, automotive and transportation another. Industry, to some extent, we're about to publish a research report on industrial IoT security. But industrial controls and SCADA security has been around for quite a while, but the attention paid to it from the hacker community has doubtless grown with the increasing capability of industrial and commercial endpoints and networks. So expect to see a lot more activity on those fronts as life and safety critical issues become more paramount to technology.
Excellent. Well, I think that'll do it for us, guys. We're going to end about 5 minutes early. Thank you, Scott, for joining us on our webinar today. And for those on the webinar, if you haven't already, make sure you download the Pathfinder report that Scott authored. We'll go even into more detail. Granted, it's not just like having you, Scott. We're not going to get the wonderful commentary, but they are going to be able to read that. They can follow you on Twitter, and I believe we retweeted some of the tweets in advance of this webinar, so check him out. Michiel, thank you so much for joining us as well. He's at Michiel on the Twitters. Guys, make sure you reach out, ask any questions. We will have the slides and the recording available to our listeners and attendees as well. So, Scott, thank you so much.